Why do we self-deceive at all?
Your mind has a lot more in it than your conscious mind. Your conscious mind is only a small part of your mind. Its job is not to know what you actually did and the actual reasons. Your brain is the sort of thing that makes up reasons for its behavior when it doesn't know.
The brain seems to have evolved to believe useful information as opposed to true information.
Right, exactly.
Dr. Robin Hanson is a polymath, a rationalist, and an associate professor of economics at George Mason University. Dr. Robin Hanson, welcome to my podcast, and thank you for joining me.
Happy to be here. You guys will notice I'm a bit sweaty. Just walked back across campus from lunch. It's kind of warm here today, but cooler than it's been, so I'll cool off.
The woes of being a human in a hot climate.
Yeah.
You've talked about many subjects, including, among other things, rationality, futurism, economics, of course, your specialization, all manner of miscellaneous topics. So why did you decide to, first of all, learn about evolutionary psychology? And secondarily, why did you decide to write a book about it?
It's not exactly a book on evolutionary psychology. We're talking about this book, The Elephant in the Brain, Hidden Motives in Everyday Life. And it's about, fundamentally, how you're wrong about your motives, or at least many of them. And that was something I was forced to conclude, or came to conclude, as an economist learning about various policy areas like medicine and education, etc., and noticing there were just a lot of puzzles there, puzzles that didn't make sense from the usual point of view. And so the book is an attempt to explain those puzzles by saying we're wrong about our motivation. So in each of these areas, we have a standard story about what the motive is. In medicine, it's about getting well. In education, it's about learning more things. In politics, it's about making a better society or charity. And we're usually pretty quick to make those assumptions because they're what most everybody says and they seem natural. And then when we try to apply those assumptions to the details, we often end up with puzzles, strange behaviors that are hard to make sense of in terms of these simple stories. So this point of the book is to say, if you just are willing to consider other motivations, you can make sense of a lot of these behaviors. So evolutionary psychology would only come into it to the extent you need a reason to make sense of these new motives we're describing.
Right. It's the explanatory framework behind it.
Right. But you don't need that. You could just accept that there are these other motives and not accept evolutionary psychology. But the question is, what are our motives in these key areas of behavior? What are the organizing goals that shape our behavior? And the main point is the usual ones don't work so well.
As Trivers has written about, and as I spoke about with Dr. David Pinsoff of Cards Against Humanity, one of the co-creators, also an academic, PhD in psychology, the brain seems to have evolved to believe useful information as opposed to true information. So the question is, if I get up after this conversation and I walk toward the doorway and I believe there is no door, when there is in fact a door, I'll end up with a sore nose. So in that sense, it's useful to accurately map the territory we inhabit. So why do we self-deceive at all?
We interact with each other. Humans manage larger groups than most other primates do, and we can do that because we have language and norms and weapons to enforce the norms. So we don't just interact with doors or trees or other parts of nature. We interact with each other, and other people are judging us and treating us on the basis of whether we're following or violating norms. And many norms are expressed in terms of motives. So if I hit you accidentally, that's much more forgivable than if I hit you on purpose. The motive I had for hitting you makes a big difference. So that's why the motives that can be easily attributed to you are important for navigating the world around you, which is why you're always looking to see what sort of motive story you can tell about what you've been doing. Because the motive stories that you can get people to believe will make a big difference to whether they see you as violating norms and therefore in need of punishment or exclusion, or following norms and therefore a citizen in good standing.
And to make this more concrete for the listener, there are a plethora of norms that we're subject to at any given moment when there's anyone around us. For example, right now, if you or I started screaming into our microphones or jumping and waving our arms around, people would think we're absolutely insane, when objectively there's nothing really so bad about that behavior, just that it's bizarre. We're subject to so many norms right now, and these are just wallpaper for the most part. They're invisible in most of life. You just get this feeling that something is weird or wrong or otherwise negative.
The total effect of them is to very much shape our behavior, but you might not notice how many of them there are, or how specifically they are coming in to change. But yes, if I interrupt you or you interrupt me, we start talking about something separately, we start insulting each other or insulting third parties. There's a whole bunch of ways we could start to violate norms, even in a conversation like this.
So why, given that so many norms are presumably antithetical to people's behavior, say I wanted to get a piece of chocolate and I'm in a store and there's just a piece of chocolate right there, why don't I just grab it?
Well, we have a world of norm enforcement, and many of those norms have laws now to support the enforcement. And so you're presumably aware of norm enforcement. So you are trying. So for example, if you're going to take the chocolate, what you might like to do is pretend, even to yourself, that you didn't mean to take it. You were just looking at it and got distracted by something else, forgot to put it down. That would be the way to avoid norm enforcement while actually walking out with the chocolate.
So the question then is, if you took the chocolate because you wanted the chocolate, what is it in you that is saying that you forgot to put it down? What is that? What is that press secretary of the brain?
Well, and to a large degree, your conscious mind is that person. Like, your mind, as you may know, has a lot more in it than your conscious mind. Your conscious mind is only a small part of your mind, but its main job is plausibly to manage these sorts of stories about yourself. So its job is not to know what you actually did and the actual reasons. Its job is more to manage a coherent story about your motives, such that that story will be one people are willing to accept, and then will excuse you from norm violations.
So why don't you just have this lawyer in your mind that's excellent at making explanations for other people, as opposed to you legitimately believing it? You'd think you'd make suboptimal choices as a result of believing false information.
Well, modularity is hard. So I was a software engineer for 9 years. Modularity is one of our main principles for organizing software. Modularity is where you make different modules and you make them depend as little as possible on each other. Your brain was not made to be very modular. That is, it was easy to just design and add things without achieving modularity. And because you don't have modularity, things leak. You leak your feelings and attitudes and intentions through all sorts of channels. You leak it through your tone of voice, the direction of your eye gaze, how nervously you're breathing, where you're looking. You just have all these ways that your attitudes and stances leak out of you. And in principle, you could make this separate modular part of your mind that had these thoughts about what to do, but had no effect on your eye gaze or tone of voice, etc. But that's actually just hard to do. Your mind just leaks in all these different ways. So the simplest thing is to have you actually believe that you didn't mean to take the chocolate, and to only have sort of small parts of your brain that see otherwise, but have them not very connected to the parts that you're conscious of.
Yeah, for better or for worse, our brain is kind of a hodgepodge creation as opposed to some optimized machine. And this about the conscious and the unconscious. I've been recently dabbling with meditation, as per the recommendations of Sam Harris, with whom you had an interesting conversation, by the way. And you start to notice when you observe your consciousness, and of course, consciousness is the only thing we ever get to observe, just as a matter of how things are. Inside your experience, you notice that, of course, your sensory percepts, like the things I'm seeing around me, the things that I'm hearing, as the listener is hearing, our voices, they seem to just appear in your mind. And then, of course, some of your thoughts and your perceptions also generate feelings, which seem to appear in your mind. But interestingly, thoughts also seem just to arise in your awareness. You don't really, in your consciousness, create a thought. You more so just perceive it. So if you couple that, the fact that your consciousness is, you're not really making things so much, you're more so observing things. You combine that with a litany of empirical findings, such as split brain patients, where they have their corpus callosum severed. These are people who have their hemispheres split. In fact, you explained this excellently in your book. Why don't you tell me about the split-brained patients and their confabulations?
Well, as you say, for various reasons that are no longer very respected, the two halves of people's brains were split apart. So each half, is tied to one ear and one eye and one hand and one leg. And then the mouth is one half of the brains and not the other. And so you can whisper into one ear in a way that the other half of the brain doesn't hear. So if you can, for example, say, stand up. And now this half of the brain will use its arm and its leg to try to start to stand up. And then the other half of your brain, noticing that you seem to be trying to stand up, will go along with that and you'll stand up. And now they could ask in the other ear to the other half of the brain, why did you stand up? And of course, the truthful answer is it doesn't know. You talk to the other half of the brain, right? It doesn't know why you stood up, but it doesn't say, I don't know. So what it does is it makes up as plausible a story as it can find about why it might wanted to have stand up. So for example, it might say, I wanted to get a Coke. That's a plausible reason why it might have stood up. So the point is that your brain is the sort of thing that makes up reasons for its behavior when it doesn't know. Now that doesn't mean it doesn't know, but it makes it more plausible that it might not know, and it might still not admit that it doesn't know. It's going to make up a reason.
The reason that there is no or limited communication is because they're severing between the two hemispheres. There's a white matter tract called the corpus callosum, and when you sever it, it severs a lot of the communication between the hemispheres, and so suddenly the part of in your left hemisphere that is responsible for creating words for the generation of speech suddenly doesn't have access to the other side of the brain. And the thing is, it shows us that while people, of course, in normal life don't make up such egregiously false and absurd explanations, it shows that there's something in there that, despite lack of information, is trying to explain away everything that it does. And you liken this to a press secretary, which I think is the perfect analogy. The press secretary isn't privy to everything that happens policy-wise, but their job is to just, as favorably as possible, explain what is happening, just for sake of image. And you seem to suggest that that's what the interpreter module in the brain is doing.
Well, more you. That is, when I'm talking to you, I'm not talking to your whole brain exactly. I'm more talking to the conscious part of your brain that will respond to me. So the you that you are aware of and most, conscious of is the part that's the press secretary. Because you don't actually know why you were doing stuff. You kind of make up reasons that seem plausible. So that's the key thing. We often just don't know why we do things. We have these big, complicated processes inside us. But we usually don't say we don't know why we don't do things. We usually have a story.
So if you combine these findings about the brain making up explanations with the fact that our consciousness really only perceives a small amount of what's happening inside the cranium, you end up with a pretty misinformed explanation confabulator. You spoke earlier about the sclera, the whites of the eyes, and you spoke about body language and it betraying things about us. I think something interesting to cover before we get into more specific instantiations of this, or more specific instances of people's hidden motives and people fooling themselves. I think an interesting concept, or a useful concept to cover, are signals. What is a signal?
So we care about each other and we want to draw conclusions about each other. We care about each other's motives, our attitudes, our beliefs, our abilities. And we're each trying to seem attractive and desirable and worth having as association to people around us. So we're all trying to look good, basically. And what are other people using to figure out what they think of us? Well, they're using the outside of us, the behaviors and appearances we have, as clues to the inside of us. And we know that, so we're trying to make our outsides look as favorable as possible to indicate the best insides. So that's literally signaling. Signaling is when you take into account the appearance of what you do and you try to slant it in the direction of looking good, having the impressions that you want to have on other people. Now, I guess in some situations, you might be trying to look bad in the sense of looking mean and tough so that nobody will mess with you, but that's still, in a sense, looking good.
You're essentially trying to project the most favorable impression of yourself in any given context.
Right. But now people will know that you're trying to do that. And so they will be wondering, whether you are just pretending. And that's why signaling equilibria are equilibria where the thing you do can't really be interpreted in any other plausible way than that you have the feature that you are claiming to have. So that typically signaling equilibria are actually pretty informative. So for example, when a predator like a lion approaches a set of gazelles in the open savanna, a thing they will do is jump straight up into the air. And they're all saying, look, I'm pretty healthy. I could run fast. If you chase me, you're not going to catch me. You're just going to get all worn out. That's a credible signal of how fast you can run is how high you can jump. And it's the gazelles who can't jump very high, which are the ones the lion is going to try to attack. So you wanted to look like you could run fast, but if you can't jump high, you won't actually be able to give that impression because it's the high jumpers who actually are consistently the ones who can run fast. So that's an example of signaling. You jump high to show that you could run fast.
And generally, to tie this into normal, modern human life, if you have a very expensive car and something like a Rolex, odds are you're probably wealthy. If you are a professor, such as yourself, and extremely educated on various topics, odds are you're pretty intelligent. You could fake it, but it's just so enormously difficult to fake something like that. That's what differentiates an honest signal versus a signal that is easily fakeable.
Right, and we often give people maybe the benefit of the doubt for a fakeable signal, but don't put too much weight on it. We let people pretend some things when we kind of know we can't really rely on it.
A perfect example is online dating. People tend to preferentially focus on the pictures because it is definitely possible, but it's harder to fake your appearance as opposed to the bio, because at the end of the day, you can say anything you want. You could just egregiously lie there, and it's not like the person is going to be able to tell unless it's too egregious.
Well, of course, it's how much effort it will be to tell. So if you go on the first date, you might be able to ask some questions that will show that they had lied, but by then you've already put a lot of effort into it. So people are looking for cheap signals as well as credible ones.
So back to the topic of body language. How is it that these evolved covert motives influence our body language in our daily interactions? What's going on there that we don't notice?
Well, as you may have heard or even seen in people around you, they have a stream of words that come out of them describing their intentions and their attitudes, etc. But often their body language gives off clues that are maybe at odds with the words they're saying. For example, they might be really nervous, shake a little, right? Or scared, and their eyes would jerk back and forth looking for danger at various points, right? Or their voice might be really stressed, and as opposed to relaxed, right? You could hear that in the stress of the voice. So we communicate many things through body language, even if we don't intend to, because, again, things leak. And so people are looking for the leaks to try to judge what we're saying. Now, in fact, we often lean into this, and a lot of what we say to people is through the body language that adds to the words we say. That is, the body language supports the words, is consistent with the words, and is expressing things. But sometimes the body language is at odds, say, with the words we would say. So, for example, flirting, people don't usually admit to flirting. they would usually deny that they're flirting, but in fact, they're flirting. So flirting is something people do with their body language in a way that they can deny if challenged and say, I was just being friendly, I was just, etc. But in fact, they do communicate flirting with their body language. As you can see, it's not only a thing we communicate, but a thing that we deniably communicate, that we don't want to admit to. Another example is what we call status moves. If two people are interacting, they typically will negotiate a relative status that is not equal. One of them will be higher status than the other, and their way they treat each other will both reflect that, as if they'd agreed on that. So things that indicate status are who initiates conversation, who looks at who looks away, who interrupts, who sets the topic, the pacing, and then lots of things about body language. So for example, being open in your body and wide is a high status stance, being closed and scrunched up and defensive is a low status stance. So just two people interacting will typically just negotiate this relative status, and then they will express it in their communication with each other. But if you ask them, which of you is higher status, they will typically deny that there is any such thing. We're just friends who talk to each other, neither of us are higher status.
And there's a propensity for humility there. No, what do you mean? Yeah, we're just friends. We're just acquaintances. So now that, given this knowledge, given that we know that people are doing this in pretty much every interaction, how do you leverage these traits? What are some things that people can actually use about their body language to signal more favorable traits, perhaps to signal more status?
So our book, The Elephant in the Brain, is basically trying to tell the world that not only do we have hidden motives, but they affect a lot of our behavior. So many of the reviewers of our book said, this is a well-known result in psychology. This isn't new. Yes, people have hidden motives, which is true. We think and by the way, there's a co-author, Kevin Sindler, for this book. We think our book is novel in applying this to 10 areas of life that it's not usually applied to show you that this matters, not just in the abstract psychology sense, but for many policy areas. So we're trying to show you that it matters for medicine and politics and charity and education. People who study these areas of life should realize these hidden motives if they're going to analyze it correctly. So if you misunderstand the motives in an area, your policy recommendations are probably just going to be pretty off. So our book is primarily targeted at people who think about these areas of life and who are trying to study them or even offer policy recommendations for them, to tell them you need to rethink your basics here if you're going to have any decent chance of making progress on understanding these things. That's our primary audience. Now, you may not be that sort of person. You might not be a social scientist. You might not be a policymaker. You just might be a person who's reading about the world, in which case we're just telling you about things you might not have realized about the world. But you say, how can I use this? And that's trying to use the book more as a self-help book. And I have to warn you, that's mostly not going to go very well. Not that you can't try, but the key thing is to be calibrated to just about how hard the task is and how much effort you can plausibly put into it. So we're talking about the basic design of the human mind here, at least recent human minds in our cultures. And this is the result of well over 1 million years of evolution of humans and our ancestors slowly changing how we think and how our minds are structured and how we use them, until we've produced this very complicated and sophisticated instrument, which is the human brain, which has a bunch of spectacular abilities that we are now continuing to use in the modern world. But part of the way these minds were structured, is that they are built not to be very aware of why they do some key things. That was how you were made. And you were made in great detail and with strong capacities in that direction. And now you at your conscious mind level are noticing this and saying, well, gee, that's not who I wanted to be. I wanted to be this honest person who always admits and knows what he wants. Can't I do that? And you think, well, if I just like do a little thinking and like repeat some phrases or maybe read a few things or have, can't that just change the whole structure of my mind that's evolved for a million years? No, sorry. You are constructed as this spectacularly complicated, impressive performance machine, but you are not given the capacity to just rearrange it all from scratch and redesign it all to your whims. That's just not who you are. You weren't given that capacity. Maybe your descendants will eventually achieve it, but not you now.
I also wanted wings. I wanted to be 8 feet tall. I wanted to have a 220 IQ, but alas, I got this mediocre body that cannot take me off the ground. It cannot reach the roof of my house. And I cannot solve quantum physics problems like they're child's play, unfortunately.
Right now, these are less that these are complicated concepts, more that you just aren't given the instruments. Like your conscious mind, first of all, just isn't in charge of most of what's happening in your mind. It's told about the results of what happens, and then its job is to maybe describe and explain that to other people around you with its best spin it can, but it's not actually making most of these decisions. So you can't just will yourself to make different decisions if you're not really in charge of them.
Right. This goes back to signaling. If you could just fake all this, then the signals wouldn't be honest and they'd be worthless. And eventually, people who actually believe in the signals would be weeded out because they'd just be deceived into oblivion.
So here's a subtler thing to say. I'd say, look, okay, you clearly can consciously reason about some things and consciously make some choices. That's a thing you have, but it's limited. You just have to see how limited you are. And now the way to think about this is you have a limited budget for honesty and clarity of perception. Where will you spend it? So I'm choosing to spend it here in trying to understand these problems and explain them to you. And that's where I have spent it, but I don't claim to be especially honest about the rest of my life, the rest of my interactions with everybody else. I'm using my limited budget in this role that I think is my especially important role in the world. And I want to try to be clearer about that. So I'm going to try to face facts directly on this abstract topic that I explained to the rest of you, but that's going to be easier if I don't focus on myself. The more I try to find my motives in a particular situation and try to be honest about that, that'll just be harder.
Right. Getting specific, again, on the topic of body language, what can we do? Is there anything that we can influence to slightly alter our perception in a more favorable manner, such as perhaps when we're entering an interaction, maybe think, open my posture a little bit more?
So actors have to learn about status moves in order to seem realistic on stage. And if you're an actor, you need to learn about them too. Most of us are not very good actors. So for the most part, you shouldn't think you're going to do a very good job of fooling people. You should mostly expect you're going to leak and people are going to figure these things out and maybe ask how you can live your life with that being okay. People often overestimate how much they can hide from the people around them. And you might better off just admitting, okay, I'm not going to hide this. Now, of course, people are often polite, and even if they can see things, they don't necessarily bring them up. And if that's what you want, that might work out okay. But first, just expect that you won't be able to hide things as well as you might want to. Also, just expect you are communicating many things, whether you intend to or not, and that your subconscious has all these things it's going along with. I guess you should admit that you and your friends have a relative status, and one of you is higher than the other, even if you don't want to be very conscious of that. Now, if you're willing to take years, people can, in fact, learn to be actors. They can learn to be salespeople. They can learn to be managers. They pay close attention to reading about and learning about specific kinds of interactions and how to give better impressions. That's something everybody has as a possibility. And most people who are older do better at these things, at giving the impressions they intend to and not realizing what will come through. But again, it's the limited budget thing. You'll have to spend a lot of time and effort on it. So what matters to you? Ask.
And then another problem is that it requires your conscious focus, because the moment your mind goes off of whatever trait you're attempting to project, it kind of collapses. You fall into your nature in some sense.
Right. Well, that's why, but successful managers or salespeople or seducers or actors, they spend years practicing so that they can, give a more reliable impression, but that's hard.
Before we move off the topic of nonverbals, tell me about this. This is probably one of the most interesting parts I found in this chapter, simply because I didn't know about it. What is the visual dominance ratio?
I think you're going to have to remind me what that is.
The visual dominance ratio was essentially the ratio between gazing while speaking and gazing while listening. That essentially, when you gaze while speaking, it's a form of information collection. You're showing that you are higher in dominance than the other individual, showing in some sense, because it's more of an agreement. So people who gaze more while speaking tend to be more dominant in the scenario, and vice versa. The people who, when speaking, will start to look away or look in some other direction tend to be more submissive. But there are two facets to human status, and the other facet is prestige. And prestige is more so based on value given in some sense. Dominance being more what I can do to you, and then prestige being something more like what I can do for you. And people who are prestigious, what they do is they gain admiration. So in that sense, the dynamic kind of flips. So the difference when people gaze at someone is that the dominant person will gaze more when they're speaking as a sort of information gathering mode. Whereas when they are listening, the less prestigious, I suppose the admirer, will gaze at them more as a show of attention, as a show that this prestigious individual has earned their attention. So to put this very concretely, if you gaze more while speaking than while listening, you tend to be perceived as more dominant. And if people gaze at you while listening and you gaze less while listening, you tend to be perceived as more prestigious. That's roughly the idea.
Well, we have this story that we all dislike dominance and love prestige. And so we say to ourselves, if somebody acts purely dominantly, i.e. throwing their weight around and just trying to be powerful, the rest of us are going to try to coordinate to stop them because we all disapprove of that so much. But somebody who's prestigious, we love them to be around, we want them to be around, and we want to give them lots of support and attention because we love prestige. This is the story we say. But as a hidden motive, we actually are more okay with dominance and more admiring of it than we like to admit. So one dramatic example is bosses. So humans traditionally had a strong egalitarian streak. That is, nobody was supposed to give orders. Nobody was supposed to tell people what to do. Nobody was supposed to threaten anybody with physical harm or other sorts of, substantial material harm. And that was the way humans lived, up until a few tens of thousands of years ago in egalitarian forager groups, which basically didn't have bosses. People didn't tell each other what to do. And then with the rise of farming, we did have bosses more. And now in the modern world, we have large organizations, companies, firms, government agencies, which have bosses. And this is a problem from the point of view of our forager selves who's still inside there. We resent being given orders, being told what to do. And not only we resent it, we think that our job is we're supposed to stop. And so we're ashamed of ourselves if we don't resist the dominance. But of course, modern world couldn't function without bosses. So how are we supposed to be okay with bosses in the modern world? Well, one way we can be okay with bosses, well, first of all, they can just avoid giving direct orders, which they typically do. They usually speak indirectly about what they'd like you to do. But better than that, if we believed our bosses were prestigious, then we wouldn't be following dominance. We would be, following prestige. And that's good and that's admirable. So all we have to do to be okay with bosses at work is to think of them as prestigious and not dominant. And their job to a substantial part is to lean into that and to be prestigious for us. So bosses have some functions in terms of coordinating activity and making key centralizing decisions and inspiring, effort. But one of the main functions that we don't admit to so much is they're just supposed to be prestigious so that we can have self-respect when we do what they suggest. And in fact, bosses do seem to be selected for prestige indicators. They tend to be taller, they have a lot more energy, they're more articulate, they're better educated. And we pay a lot for the people who have those indicators because they can actually get people to do what they say. It's not so much about understanding what was requested as being not ashamed of yourself in going along with it.
I think that's a useful takeaway. Certainly an interesting takeaway, if nothing else. And that is that while the pretext is often egalitarianism in our daily interactions, the subtext is essentially always status. There's always that implicit undercurrent running beneath our interactions,
which we don't like to admit. So as you probably know, it doesn't look good to say you're trying to pursue status. So when people say what you're trying to do, you should say anything else but I'm trying to get status here. But of course, that's what we're quite often trying to do.
So let's move to the verbal now. We've covered the nonverbal. Let's move to the verbal. Why do we talk so much?
So the puzzle here isn't practical language, like ordering a pizza or telling someone the back door is open or, all sorts of, we do a lot of practical talk, but we also have all this chit chat. Ways where we don't really need to coordinate through words, but we just keep talking. We do a lot of chit chat. We fill the time with chit chat. And the question is, why? Why all that talking? I mean, it does take a little bit of energy. One simple story that we give, which has some truth to it, is that we're sharing information. So I tell you a story about what happened to me at work, or what happened at the store, etc. That will be information that you could use perhaps to, it expands the range of your experiences, and now you know more about the world and about things that can happen in the world. Or I might even tell you about some person who moved in the neighborhood, spread gossip about them, and now you'll know about this new person, right? We could just share information. But there's some problems with this explanation. So the structure of the whole book is going to be, there's a usual explanation and there's some problems with it, and then we have an alternative explanation that fits better. So the problems with this usual explanation is if we were trading information, we would each be reluctant to talk and eager to listen. Whereas we seem to be the opposite. We would also maybe keep track of who owes who how much. I've told you 3 useful things. You need to start talking to me more useful things, but we don't seem to do that. And we would talk about actually stuff that mattered. Whereas often a lot of our chit chat seems to be about stuff that doesn't really matter much to us. So these are clues that maybe this motive story isn't the whole story. We aren't just talking to share information. Well, the alternative story that we outline in the book is more of a signaling story. We each have what you might think of as a backpack of mental tools and information and things we might be able to share. When we have a conversation, our job is whenever something shows up, we're supposed to pull something out of our backpack that's relevant and say, see, I have something relevant. And so we just go back and forth on relatively trivial topics, but still each of us is supposed to bring up something relevant we think we have for the topic. And that's a way we credibly show we've got this great backpack of tools. So if something important were to show up, why we would be ready, we would have all these great tools and resources that we could bring to bear on whatever it was. And that explains why we don't talk about important things, while the conversation wanders without much structure, why we don't keep track of who said how much important things so far. And we don't even, we're not so eager to just listen. We do want to talk because we want to show off.
So this explains why people tend to talk other people's ears off instead of shutting up and just gathering information.
Right, exactly. Because, hey, what's the point of talking? You're not learning much when you're talking, right?
And even when you do listen, oftentimes you'll just hear a bunch of useless trivia or other information that after leaving the conversation, you'll just forget and never use again.
Right, but you still might be impressed with their ability to have said all the things they did.
Right, but the fact is that the pretext might be information gathering, but that's certainly not the subtext. The subtext is more what? Bonding, showing other people our traits.
Well, bonding and showing off. So some of your resources can be, we certainly do show loyalty in conversations, like who we even talk to shows some loyalty. And what we talk about and whether you flatter people, that shows some loyalty. But in addition to showing loyalty, we also want to show ability, i.e. all the things we know.
Speaking of odd noises we make with our mouths, there's another one that is these punctuated exhalations. And often in response to something that we deem, for whatever reason, humorous. Why in the world did we evolve laughter? It's truly a bizarre behavior.
So there's a set of usual explanations of laughter that don't work very well. But sometimes we think it's about insulting people or about noticing something that's surprising, some things like that. They don't really work that well as theories. The theory that we think does work well, better than the others, is tied to the idea of play. So many animals play, and what play is some pretend version of reality, which is safer. So we could pretend fight or pretend chase, and in that process, we could learn more about the process of fighting and chasing, but without all the damage. So when animals are playing, they need a way to notice when they're playing. They need to sort of mark it out, as we're about to play, we're playing, and then they need a way to stop it when something more important happens and playtime's over. And in humans, laughter is a we're still playing signal. So a lot of our play is about social threats because we are a very social species. So we pretend to insult each other or pretend to chase each other or somewhere in our words. And so we pretend in some ways to be socially mean with our words. But by laughing, we show that we're still playing. It's fine.
This sounds a lot like comedy. We're playfully pretend violating norms, violating taboos.
Right, so a lot of comedy does apparently violate norms. And the fact that the audience is all still laughing is okay. Now, some of the puzzles about laughter are that most of the time when we laugh, there isn't a joke involved. And we laugh a lot less often when we're by ourselves than when we're with other people. And speakers actually laugh more often than listeners do. So the idea that somebody told a joke just doesn't work very well as an explanation for laughter.
That's just the laughter we notice.
Right, or that you maybe you have an explanation for, but we laugh a lot more than that.
Because when you're speaking and you start laughing, you're more focused on the speaking than you are the laughing. I believe the estimate you shared in your book was that people tend to laugh roughly 30 times more when they're with someone else than when they are alone, which is certainly indicative of it being a social behavior.
Right, and we maybe even make fun of people who laugh by themselves because that's more of an antisocial thing to do, whatever. And many of the old, cartoons with the villain had a villainous laugh. And the point was this villainous laugh wasn't a very genuine laugh. It didn't, make you relaxed and feel like we're still playing. It was a threatening, sort of harsh, mean, deliberate laugh. Exactly the sort that you shouldn't trust.
Can evolutionary psychology and knowing why we laugh, knowing that laughter is a play signal, can this give us any insights on how to elicit laughter more in our conversational partners?
Well, presumably you have to actually play. So if you try to memorize some jokes, that's not going to work so well, right? People often have said about their lovers, what do I love about him? He makes me laugh or something like that, right? I'm sure that's true as a correlation, but trying to tell more jokes isn't really going to work for that. The point is that when you laugh with someone, that's because you're playing with them. You're feeling comfortable and safe enough with them to laugh, and then you are playing and you are laughing. So I would say just focus on actually being playful, and actually, being relaxed and getting them relaxed enough to play, and then do the play, and then the laughter would follow.
Right. And there's a marked difference between a witty comment and then going up to someone and saying, knock, knock, right? Expecting them to respond to your joke. And now you can say something barely funny. You'd think that if laughter is a play signal and it's showing that within serious behaviors, we are in fact playing, you'd think that in uncertain scenarios where it could be interpreted as serious, people would laugh more. Is that a finding? Is that the case?
Well, again, it depends on how threatened they feel. So people need to actually feel safe enough to get into play mode if they're going to laugh. So uncertainty often goes with threat. So I would say if somebody's in an uncertain situation, the main thing is, well, what are the threatening scenarios that could be applying here that they can't be sure aren't true here? Those threatening scenarios are going to be the ones that make it harder for them to laugh.
Do you think that people, potentially the person more responsible for the perceived social threat, would laugh more as a signal of, oh, I'm just playing?
They may well try, but whether people will go along with it depends on whether they're convinced.
Right.
So there's a standard bully scenario, as you may know, where A bullies B and then says, can't you take a joke?
I'm just kidding.
Right, exactly, right. And so people will often use this pretend play as a way to excuse their real, hurting people. And then often people feel obligated to go along with that. They feel like they'll be seen as weak or, insecure if they don't say, oh yeah, haha, that was funny.
Right. Don't take everything personally. Don't be such a snowflake.
Right, exactly. So that can be a way to bully people, to abuse people, because they might not want to admit that they find something threatening or abusive. And so they therefore might go along with the pretense that it's all just good fun when it's not.
Excellent. And now the bullies in the audience have another tool with which to arm themselves. The subtext under a lot of these things is signaling. There's a lot of signaling and norm flouting. That seems to be the major motivations behind these. Maybe to violate a norm subtly, but with plausible deniability, so that you can escape enforcers, potentially people calling you out on your violations. That way you can escape them. Oh, you cut me in line. Why? Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't see you, right? Something like that. The other one seems to be signaling. And I think that the most salient example of signaling is conspicuous consumption. That's probably one of the more famous terms of evolutionary psychology. Tell me about consumption.
So, we're eager to bring down the high. We're not only egalitarian, but we're just envious and jealous, right? So when we find something the rich do more than the rest of us that's a little illicit, we're all over that. We just love that. And that's what conspicuous consumption is. Conspicuous consumption is just spending a lot to show that you can spend a lot. And that, of course, is something the rich people can do more than the rest of us. And so the rest of us are quite eager to point out that maybe they're just doing all this to show off, which is an illicit sort of thing to do. Now, in fact, we all spend with an eye to how it makes us look. Maybe we don't have as high a budget as other people, but we're still thinking about how our spending is going to make us look. But since most of us aren't rich, the main message for most of our spending isn't that I'm rich. It might be that I'm not poor, but we try to fit in as many other messages as we can into our spending. So as long as you're going to buy a car, maybe you'll buy a eco-friendly car. And you'd like it to look really obviously like an eco-friendly car so that everybody will give you credit for your eco-friendly car, right? So that would be a thing you could signal with your car. Advertising plausibly helps us signal many things with all of our products because it creates associations with our products. So we discuss in the book a famous beer company who has ads whose main content is just somebody's on a beach drinking their beer. And there's really not much else to the ads. But if there's one thing you know about this beer, it's the beach beer. So now once everybody's seen this ad, if you want to seem beachy for some reason, that's the image you want to project to people around you. You just hold that beer, and there it is. You're beachy. And so advertising then expands the range of things you can say about yourself indirectly. Now, of course, anybody's allowed to buy the beer, even if they're not actually beachy. So the main thing you get is somebody wants to be seen as beachy, but that's something interesting to know about a person. This person would like to be seen as beachy. And then maybe you could look at the rest of are they suntanned, for example? Do they look muscular? Like whatever else you think goes along with being beachy. If they've got those other things, maybe you'll give them credit for the beer as well. And you'll say, okay, I see a package there. I guess that's beachy.
So essentially showing positive traits to other people, as is the case with all the other things that we've discussed so far. You gave in the book an excellent example of, I think it's probably the best way I've heard to understand this for somebody who has who is completely new to the idea. And that's I believe you called them the obliviated society. Tell me about that, the people who have completely inconspicuous consumption.
Right. So one counterfactual to help you understand how your world is full of signaling is to try to imagine people who couldn't see the signals. So to make it a coherent example you can understand, we imagine you can still function in your world. You can still see where the doors are and, you can cook the food and not burn your fingers. But when you see other people and having features, you just don't notice the connection. You don't notice the beach beer in their hand. You don't notice the suntan. You don't notice the expensive watch. You're just not noticing all of these signals. And of course, everybody knows that they're not noticing these signals. So then they don't put so much effort into those signals. So that a world, if you can start to imagine it, you can see you would actually do a lot of things pretty differently. You'd make sure your clothes were comfortable, but you wouldn't care so much how rich they made you look or how well presented they made you look. You wouldn't necessarily get an expensive car. You would get a car that got you from here to there functionally. So once you can imagine this alternative world where we didn't draw any conclusions from various aspects of people's behavior and surroundings, when you see how different that world would be, now it helps you see how much of signaling is infusing your world.
Right. You'd be completely pragmatic. You'd be wearing the most comfortable sweatpants you have to go everywhere. Maybe you're shirtless.
Right.
Maybe you're just wearing a soft t-shirt. Your car is just whatever has good gas mileage and costs the least amount of money. Your house is just however much space you need to live comfortably. Your food would just be whatever tastes good. You wouldn't worry about getting the expensive food or anything like that. You just probably eat similar things, maybe a little bit of variety.
If we posit that you can see some signals, not others, like for example, maybe we can notice your vocabulary and that you use a lot of big words. Well, now in this world, you're going to put a lot of work into that because that's one of the few things other people can see.
You just replace the source of your signaling.
Right. So that's a key story about signaling in our world. We signal through so many different channels all the time that if we got rid of one or two of these channels, it's not going to stop us from signaling. It's just going to move our efforts into all the other channels. There's really not much prospect of stopping signaling in our world. It's just way too infused in all our behavior.
It's just baked into our natures.
But we might be able to switch which ones are how important. And that's the thing that has changed over the years because our status markers, the things that we use to count who's how important and who's how impressive, have changed. We put different amounts of effort into different things now.
Perfect example, environmental friendliness. Nobody gave a damn about that 200 years ago.
Right. So people might have done things in that direction, but they weren't doing it because of the way it looked.
Right. Another realm of consumption that you cover is charity. Tell me about charity. Are people really just not nice and trying to help?
Well, our simple theory of charity is that you're trying to help. And then, again, as we do in the rest of the book, we show you a bunch of correlates of charity, facts about charity that are somewhat at odds with the simple theory. For example, if you were just trying to be the most effective with your charity, you'd probably find the one most effective thing to do and to put all your effort into that, although people seem to want to spread it out over lots of other kinds of charity. People are more willing and likely to do charity things when somebody asks or when people are watching them or where mating motives are invoked. And people are just not very attentive to how effective their charities are. So as long as there's some plausible appearance of effectiveness, they mainly just care to show that they were willing to sacrifice for it, but not how much it actually helps on the other end. And so a lot of charities are in fact sloppy and not very effective because nobody cares that much if they are.
And you're not suggesting that people are just secretly trying to look as good as possible while simultaneously not giving a damn about anybody else. That's why we talked about the interpreter module, the press secretary. And it's not to say it's false. We often do want to help people because simply for one clear reason is that it feels good, or maybe we feel we have an ethical duty. But the fact is, if you look at where people donate, not everybody is an effective altruist. People are donating in sometimes suboptimal manners that are more conspicuous and less actually effective. That's more your claim, right? Not so much that people are these subconsciously Machiavellian individuals.
The question is, the people around us, do they want us to care? Who do they want us to care about how? So here's a simple story that gets closer, which is the people around us, they're thinking someday they might need help. Something could go wrong in their life and they might need to ask you for help. They're wondering, would you help in that situation? And if you're giving off signs that you would in fact help them in that situation, then they'd like to be around you. You would be a good person to have around as insurance against these future problems.
A good ally.
Right. Now, if you're the sort of person who calculates who most in the world needs help and only helps them, do they think they're going to be the person who most needs help in the world? Not very likely. So it's actually not very reassuring to them to see you as the sort of person who sits down and calculates who in the world most needs help. What they would rather is that you're the sort of person when they see a person that they know in front of them in need, like you could be if you needed help, then they would help that person. So they need them to not be so calculating about who's the best person to get help, just more reacting to some need directly in front of them. That would reassure the people around you that you would help them if they needed help. And so that's the kind of caring you're trying to show. You're trying to show this spontaneous, emotional, you just can't help but help when you see somebody in need in front of you, because that's what will make you help them when they put themselves in front of you.
And I think that spontaneous emotionality is key to this. It's somewhat akin to, say, finding a mate. And then you ask them, why do you love me? And they say, well, your waist to hip ratio is pretty close to 0.7. Your face is kind of symmetrical. Yeah. You're wittier than average, which indicates that you're intelligent.
Right. Yeah.
So that's why. And also, you're the best that I could get given my mate value. You don't want to be with this person because they're just going to trade up if they're doing it all rationally. But it's a lot more consoling to hear something like, and reassuring, I just love you for who you are. I don't know. I just feel some way about you that I don't feel about with anybody else.
Or more specifically, I would hate to lose you. That would just crush me.
Right. Exactly. And then you think, oh, this person's going to stay with me.
Exactly. And even put up with a bit of stuff in staying with you.
Maybe put up with a lot of stuff. On the topic of caring about people, this was probably the most surprising topic I've heard you speak and write about, and it's medicine.
We are at a world historical peak in the United States of amount spent on medicine. Amount and even percentage. We're spending roughly 18% of the economy on medicine and have for a little while. And at no time or place in history did people even spend that large a percentage on medicine. And then we're record rich. So the amount is just off the charts. We are just crazy about medicine in the US today. Now, the rest of the world isn't as crazy as the US, but they're still at a historical peak for their location for the amounts being spent on medicine. We're still, every place in the world is spending a lot more on medicine than they used to in that place in the world, as a percentage and as an absolute. So our world today really likes medicine. So that's going to make it a surprise to hear that medicine doesn't do what you think it does. As you probably know, the usual story we all have about medicine is, well, usually we're healthy, but then sometimes we can get sick and injured. And if we're sick or injured, there are these specialists, doctors, who can help. They have very specialized, expensive tools and equipment, but it can often make all the difference between your being sick or healthy. So you'll need to pick who they are through some specialized means, because the most of us don't know how to tell who are the better doctors. And you'll need to have some sort of insurance to pay for it, because it can be damn expensive when it shows up. But hey, it's so valuable that you're going to want it. That's our standard story about medicine. There's a number of things that don't fit that standard story, but the most dramatic one is we have randomized experiments where some people get more medicine and other people get less, and the people who get more medicine are just not consistently healthier. There's just not this basic relationship between medicine and health that people tend to presume. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't cases where, in fact, medicine actually causally made people healthier. But unfortunately, what this implies is that on the margin, at least, there are as many other cases where medicine made people worse on the margin in order to add up to this average no effect. So
for it to be average without any kind of harmful medicine, that would mean that nobody gets any benefit, where clearly some people do get benefits.
And some people get hurt.
Right, that's what keeps the average
at zero. So now, first of all, some clarification. This is about the margin of medicine, like when you get more versus less. It's less clear about the medicine everybody gets in common. Like if there's some kind of medicines that everybody's going to get, no matter what they pay for, where they live, or et cetera, then this isn't speaking to that. This is speaking out the medicine that some people get that other people don't. So we have a number of other puzzles about medicine, but this one stands out as a pretty big one. Other puzzles are, it's a luxury. We tend to spend more on it as we get richer. We tend to want to socialize it and provide it collectively. We really are eager to regulate it. But there's an alternative explanation here, which is very simple and intuitive, and I think everybody thinks it happens to some degree. They might be surprised about how much. Is just that we use medicine to show that we care about each other. Somebody is, a little under the weather, a little stressed, a little worried, and we want to reassure them, we care about you. Don't worry, you're with people who care about you and want to help you. And the way we help them is often to get them some medicine. So spouses will push you to get a doctor's appointment to go visit the doctor. Then if you have something the doctor says to do, they'll show you support by helping you get it, whether it's rest or certain prescriptions or different eyeglasses, whatever it is. We're eager to show our help. And even if they're in the hospital for a while, we want to show up and visit and show that we care and that we're there. We're all very eager to show each other that we care. And that actually is a very emotionally potent thing. And it's very strong to see when you're scared and a little vulnerable, other people are willing to step in and show how much they care about you. And we even like that other people see that. We like not only ourselves to see that the people around us care about us, but for everybody around us to see that we've got people who have our back. They care about us and they're willing to be there for us when we need help. And that's a plausible reason why medicine might have gotten started in the first place long ago. Most medical historians suggest that, in fact, medicine hasn't actually been useful on the margin for a long time. But then some say, well, maybe recently it's changed. Finally, now with scientific medicine, we've got medicine that's actually effective. But through most of history, no, it wasn't very effective. That's the standard story of medical historians.
Right. Medicine was useless, if not actively harmful, for, I think, the first, nearly 2 millennia that it existed. People were just doing all these absurd practices that were either useless or killing their patients, like bloodletting, stuff relating to the humors and that kind of thing.
So we actually have medical textbooks from ancient Egypt from many thousands of years ago. And they're surprisingly like medical textbooks of today in that they're full of very complicated procedures with specific things you push and things you make and things you do and then things you say in order to produce the outcomes they claim to get. And according to our current knowledge, most of the stuff wouldn't have been very effective, but some of it would have helped. But you paid a lot for very specialized people to have very complicated specialized treatments thousands of years ago in ancient Egypt.
You would think that it's just pragmatic if people are just doing things that they think are cures. But the strange thing, the thing that indicates potential signaling, is the fact that a lot of those ancient medical treatments were so elaborate. It's just this elaborate, costly signal.
Right now, people at the time, even the doctors, may have believed that they were helping.
Yeah, of course.
And the patients may have believed they were getting help. So our story is about the larger social forces that put this practice together and kept it going. And the key idea is, if you were skeptical about medicine and said, that doesn't work, forget that, you would not show the people around you that you cared about them. They would less believe that you cared about them because you weren't going through this usual signal of showing that you care. And you also might not get other people to show they care about you. And then people would have doubts about whether you really have allies. And then they might be more willing to take a chance to cause a conflict with you because you don't have allies. So we do think this story makes more sense of medical behavior, but it's a big question then. Well, so should you personally get less medicine? Or should you give less medicine to your associates once you believe this? Or is there a way to reorganize medicine to be more useful to us all? So this is clearly a huge failing in the sense of, again, we're spending 18% of GDP on this service, and on the margin, it's just not actually helping. So plausible, we could cut way back on the amount we spent, and it wouldn't actually hurt as much on health, but it might make people think we didn't care as much. So could we find a way to spend a similar amount more effectively, or a smaller amount, but still convince people that we care about them? Those are the policy questions this raises.
Essentially, how can we get the best health results per dollar?
While still showing that we care. Right. Now, I think there are ways to do this, but the question is, how do we get anybody to care? So apparently, it's a really amazing thing to realize. People think that fear of death drives a lot of behavior, but apparently it's more fear of thinking about death that drives behavior. People, when they are scared of death, they just want to trust their doctors and their medical system and put it out of their head and just do whatever they're told, because that's less stressful. They don't have to think about the fact that these choices might make them die. So they're more scared of thinking about death than they are about death. And
which makes sense also, because whenever you attempt to research something like this, and I mean legitimately, not just reading anecdotes, you're confronted with a bunch of medical jargon that doesn't make sense and just an overwhelming wave of information. And at this point, you're stressed because it's impactful to your health. It's confusing. You don't understand it. And it makes sense that you just want to trust a professional.
But you want to trust the sort of people other people trust. So there was a point when a government agency tried out telling patients about to undergo surgery about the stats for their surgeon and other surgeon in their area. Okay. And you might think, okay, I'm about to undergo a surgery that maybe has a 1 or 2% chance of dying in the surgery. Gee, maybe I'll want to look at some stats of my surgeon compared to other surgeons at their hospital or other hospitals. And so they asked people, how much would you be willing to pay for this information about these stats? And then if we gave you the information, does it change what you do? So it turned out only 8% of people were willing to pay even $50 for this information. And when they just gave it to them, they didn't react to it. They didn't act on it. They didn't change their surgeon, even when they got surgeons who were worse.
So to clarify, 92% of people were unwilling to pay $50 or more for this information, even though they were attempting to save their life, one would think, no doubt paying way more than that for the actual surgery. And of those 8%, some of the people didn't change their decision despite the information.
On average, they didn't change their decision despite the information.
I don't want these 92% responsible for anything that has anything to do with me.
But this is your world, and this means it's probably you too. So
exactly.
Most of you actually don't want to comparison shop your medical cover treatment because it's too scary to think about. You just want to go with whoever you've been told to trust.
But obviously not you, obviously not me, obviously not the very intelligent and rational listeners. Of course not. It's all the other people.
So again, my basic strategy here is to just assume I'm like everybody else.
Yes.
And maybe I'm an exception in some ways, but probably not.
No, we're definitely so much more rational than everybody else. Yeah, that itself is another bias. The bias that everybody else is more biased and we are less than average.
This was the first view I had of this larger phenomena we've called the elephant in the brain, where we have these hidden motives that make a big difference to our behavior. So once I saw, even in medicine, which supposedly we think matters to us a lot, we're just blind to our basic motives there. I thought, well, could that be true elsewhere? And that's when I started to look elsewhere for other places where we could be blind to our motives.
One such place that you talk about in your book is education. That education is not, in fact, simply for the purpose of learning.
I have a colleague across the hall here, Brian Kaplan, who has a book called The Case Against Education. So my chapter in this book is mostly a summary of his book. But our usual story about education is we're there to learn the material, which is material that will help us be a better citizen and employee, et cetera, in our future life, right? That's the standard story. And we structure school around that. We have textbooks and curricula and homework and exams, all set up as if the point was to learn this stuff that you're taught. And they're on topics that are at least vaguely related to things you might work on later in life, all set up to make you believe that, in fact, the point of school is to learn this stuff. But then, remarkably, we find that people actually hardly remember any of the stuff they were taught. And the stuff they do remember isn't very useful. And most of you who are older and have been out of school for a while probably will notice that, most of the stuff you learned wasn't actually very useful. Nevertheless, the people who get more education just make more money as a consistent trend. There's a bunch of other puzzles we could go over, but the basic answer here is to say you're showing off at school. You're showing off a bunch of attractive features as an employee. You're smart, you're conscientious, you're conformist. You've learned modern workplace practices. You can sort of be given an assignment and just go spend even a week or longer working on it before you come back with your results. Those are all nice features about employees, but it's not because of the material you learned.
What makes you say it's not because of the material specifically?
Because you don't remember it. And it's actually not very useful.
And there are a lot of ways, you mentioned this as well, that there are many ways it could be restructured to make it a more, you can make the tests better indicators of how much you actually will know going into the job to be useful. Like testing somebody on everything they learn at the end of the year.
There's just different ways of structuring the learning so you could learn more. We could make the topics more practical and more useful. We could test you repeatedly many years later to see whether you still remember stuff. But we don't, because it seems like we don't actually care.
Now, a question to you under your economist hat as opposed to your psychologist hat. Does the economic return on investment for an individual justify getting an undergraduate education? So let's say somebody just gets out of high school. Would, economically speaking, is it worth investing in a college degree in terms of how much money they're going to make later on?
So think about whether it's worth it to, be a great basketball player. Like, if you're an unusually good basketball player and then you can play basketball and then a lot of people sitting around you can just see how impressive you are, that could just be worth it for you to impress the people around you. But that's only because you're especially good. It's not because everybody should be doing basketball. It's only the people who are unusually good who should get a benefit from doing basketball. So similarly for college, if it's a way to show off, it doesn't work for everybody to do it. It can't work for everybody to do it to show off. It can only work for the people who are unusually good at it. Those are the people for whom it'll work for them to do it to show off. But if you're trying to get everybody to go to college, well, then they all can't look good by comparison to nobody so much. So the low end of the distribution of ability to go to college is not going to get a benefit out of this, except as they're going to show that they're not even worse.
So pragmatically speaking, the more traits you actually have to show off, the more worthwhile it is to do something like an advanced education.
Right, so we have a literature on education, and the people who are the best at school are getting the best signal out of their going to school.
Shocker.
And people who are not very good at it, even when they push themselves through, they get some credit for saying, okay, you've got some determination, you've got some persistence, okay? But in some sense, that's what you're showing off. You show that, okay, you persisted farther than other people would, good for you. But again, you have to be careful about how much effort you're putting in. Signaling can be a waste. So there's a robust way in which signaling is overall wasteful, because what you do basically is you gain a personal advantage by making yourself look better than somebody else who ends up looking worse as a result. And you're focused on your benefit and you're not considering their cost. So anything that helps you and hurts other people at the same time, you're probably going to do too much of. And so most signaling is like that. Now, signaling can have some benefits of sorting, that we can figure out who goes in which roles in life more easily. Otherwise, we have to try people out in the roles and see how they do and adjust to that. But generally, the benefit of that isn't worth the cost to society, but it might be worth it to you.
So essentially, something like an education is more like a convoluted and lengthy IQ and personality test of sorts. It's
right.
It's more so to tell people about traits than to actually learn things. Because one would think anyways that knowing the ins and outs of basic physics, for example, is going to be absolutely useless if you're a bartender or something. And yet, bartenders with a college degree earn more.
So there's an old saying about being chased by a bear. Two
Yes.
people see a bear, one starts to run, the other says, you can't outrun a bear. And he says, I don't need to outrun the bear, I just need to outrun you. So that's the personal benefit you can get by signaling, that you can look better than other people. But you could still all be overall worse off from being in the situation where you have to signal.
Or you can all be objectively better off, as in with our current economic circumstances. We live like nobility, and yet there's still this relative aspect of, it's not just that I can pay for everything I need to be able to earn more than the Joneses over there. And hence we all continue to be in the rat race, so to speak. Now,
you might plausibly say, look, if signaling has this, what we call externality, way it hurts other people, even if it benefits yourself, that should be exactly a role for, say, government to step in and limit the harm that we're doing to each other. So then you might think government would step in and say, not so much signaling. And in the past, there were what called sumptuary laws, where you would limit what kind of ways you could show off with fancy clothes as you walk down the street or things like that. But in the modern world, we are doing too much signaling through buying too much education and buying too much medicine, and governments actually lean into this and make them worse. They subsidize these things instead of taxing them as they should. And so instead of fixing these problems, governments are actually making them substantially worse.
At this point, the listener may be inflamed a little bit. They may be thinking, well, what do you mean by all this? They might be feeling a little bit uneasy. So just to ensure that nobody gets out of this conversation unscathed, let's get into the really inflammatory stuff. Politics. What's happening with politics? Are we all really just do good, active citizens trying to make our country better?
The usual story that we give is that we are involved in politics because we want the nation, city, whatever unit we're involved with to do better. So we're trying to figure out what are the better policies, who are the candidates who will try to push for better policies, and then convince people to vote for them and vote for them ourselves. That's our usual story about politics. We're trying to make things better. There's a bunch of puzzles about politics. This doesn't fit very well. So like with charity, people are not very attentive to information. They aren't learning very much about the actual policies or the politicians or their effects or things like that. They're not paying very close attention to that. They're not paying much attention to how pivotal their vote's going to be, whether their vote's actually going to make a difference. They are excessively emotional. They don't notice how they don't actually care about whether their politician can influence some policy. They just want to make sure they have a position on the topic that agrees with them. So we give the example of the apparatchik as a more apt representative of who you are with respect to politics. So the story is back in the old Soviet Union, there was run by Stalin, and everybody was supposed to say, "Yay, Stalin." And so there was a meeting, and in the meeting, Stalin's name was mentioned. And at the mere mention of Stalin's name, the entire room stands up and starts clapping, "Yay, Stalin." And they keep clapping for 10 minutes. And while they're clapping at the end, each person's thinking, if I'm the first person to stop clapping, I'm going to look suspiciously disloyal to Stalin. But eventually, somebody had to be the first to stop clapping, and then everybody else could stop clapping soon after. And then that guy was sent to Siberia that night because he was the suspicious person who stopped clapping before the others.
They didn't have to outrun the bear. They just had to outrun the slow guy.
Exactly. So the story is that the thing that makes a difference in our lives is how the people around us react to our politics. We're not actually very focused on who's going to win the election and what policies are going to be changed. But we do care to show our associates that we, in fact, are on their side. And they care about this too. In fact, you do surveys of like, who would you give a scholarship to, or who would you let marry your child? People really want these people to agree with their politics. People are strongly motivated to want to help and support people who agree with their politics and to do the opposite to people who don't. And this is a fact in our lives that is important to us because it affects our personal lives. How will the people around us treat us? And so this is the thing that drives our political actions, is reassuring the people around us that we are sufficiently on their side. And that's important enough to us that it does make sense to pay substantial attention to politics in order to at least make sure that people around you don't think you're evil.
Or apathetic.
Which is halfway to evil, I guess.
You said that people they vote for value, something along the lines of people vote for values and not for results. That oftentimes people vote just because of something that is important to them, but not in reality to get any kind of a specific outcome. In fact, people are generally ignorant of the outcomes.
Right. So, for example, in the United States, presidents don't have much to do with education. But people still want to elect a president who agrees with their position on education. And there are often people who know how to work well behind the scenes to make things happen. That is, just because there's a bunch of people who sort of agree with each other doesn't mean they can actually make stuff happen. Actually, you need special skills to get these people to actually act together and make stuff happen. Voters don't care much about those special skills about making stuff happen. They just want to know what your positions are.
Right, because at the end of the day, if the average voter cared about results, they probably wouldn't even bother voting. Unless they happen to be perhaps a very consequential person. Like if you have a following of 100,000, 200,000 people, maybe you'll actually be engaged in politics. But every individual vote is functionally useless. Like the actual utility of me going to vote, it takes up hours of my time I have to schedule it and get out of my other obligations. And then the actual results of the vote are essentially nil.
But for most people in our world, they actually spend a lot more time per year thinking about and discussing politics than they do voting. It might make more sense just to go do the one damn vote and vote randomly than to spend all the time they do discussing politics.
Right. So it's not, and that's another thing is I've noticed a lot of political conversation is just with peers. A lot of political education is just listening to pundits who are preaching to the choir, because oftentimes a leftist is not going to go listen to right-leaning media and vice versa. People are going to listen to people who agree with them, and then they just get their entertainment in, and, nothing of consequence has changed.
Most people were happy to tell you what they would do if they were king or queen. If I ruled the world, what policies would I implement? Now you ask them, okay, on which things would you compromise to get which other things? People hate to talk about that, but that's how politics works. Politics is a result of compromises. Different parties come together and compromise with each other to make some joint political policy thing happen. So if you aren't willing to compromise, you just really can't actually have some real effect. But people will hate to tell you what they would compromise. What, you want this thing. What will you give up to get that thing? They aren't willing to give up anything.
All my values are important. Right.
Exactly.
The only plausible solution for that is an autocrat, someone who just, what they say goes. Then you're going to get no compromises. But otherwise, yeah, we have to put up with that. Now, if people aren't already inflamed, if there are any who have escaped unscathed, let's go further into the anthill here. Tell me about religion. Is religion what it seems?
So if we were doing this discussion a century ago, most people would be a lot more animated and passionate about the subject, certainly 2 or 3 centuries ago. So in our world today, we have this remarkable decline of passion about religion. Now, there are still many people who have opinions on religion, but far fewer people go to church or interact with other people according to their religion. So, in fact, this isn't actually very disturbing to people today, and maybe that's a disturbing fact. This thing that had been very central to human behavior for a long time is today seen as just not very interesting or important. But still, there is this question, what's it about? What's the point? So now, ancient religions often didn't care what you believed. They just care what you did, whether you made the right ritual sacrifices, etc. But Christianity and other more modern religions have cared about what you believe. And so many people have as their explanation for religion your beliefs. Say, why do these religious people do these weird things? Well, because they have these weird beliefs. But in fact, it doesn't explain that very well. Now, a remarkable fact about religion, though, is that religious people win on pretty much every social margin. They, have more income, their marriages last longer, they have less crime, they have more kids, their kids are happier, they're healthier, just on all of the different things you could think of as a success metric, religious people are winners. So how could they all be winning so much from just having sort of random, strange beliefs? The random, strange beliefs theory of religion doesn't really explain why they seem to do so well. Now, there's another standard old theory of religion that we're just going to pick up in this book, which is just religion binds groups together. Groups of people, when they share these weird beliefs, they can more count on each other, trust each other, rely on each other when things have trouble. And that religion does, in fact, provide the service of letting people see that they can trust each other. And in order to do that, you'll have to believe something stranger than the sky is blue. Is somebody else who believes the sky is blue with you, can you trust them? Not especially. There wasn't much of a sacrifice to believe that. It's more of a sacrifice to believe strange stuff. It's the strange beliefs that they are believing along with you that binds them to you and makes you believe that they would help you out if you needed it.
on the topic of people behaving in a way that is somewhat, well, discordant with their beliefs, you'd think that if people believed, this is something I told to Dr. David Pinsoff in a previous conversation, you'd think that if people legitimately believed in their religious ideas, that they would become monks and scriptural scholars. And some people, of course, do that. But it's at least strange to me that most religious people just say they're religious. They hold a handful of credences, and then they don't really do much about it. A lot of them haven't even read the Bible. They don't go to church regularly. It's just kind of strange.
To be fair, most people with abstract beliefs are similarly uninfluenced by them in their personal actions. So people who have a wide range of abstract beliefs they could get from being a college student, say, about, I don't know, the fact that we all evolved from simple animals, or we're all going to die, or the beliefs people have about the economy or the nature of love. Just in general, abstract beliefs don't show up very much in people's concrete behavior. That's just a more fact about abstract beliefs, really.
Perfect example is psychology students. They'll learn things about the mind, tendencies of the mind, and then they'll go about their lives as if it doesn't apply to them. They just don't. They have it in their mind. Another example is the idea of lack of free will. I'm obviously not. I haven't thought about the topic a whole lot, but it seems plausible to me that we don't have free will, and yet I go about every single day just as I did before I thought this. Nothing has changed. I hold an entire storehouse of beliefs that don't really do much for my everyday life.
It's actually a fair bit of work to connect abstract beliefs to your concrete everyday actions. And most people who bother to collect abstract beliefs just don't bother to do that extra work of figuring out what it would imply, and then even to go so far as to do it. I mean, but in some sense, this is healthy. So, the basic thesis of our book is we have actual motives for our behaviors, and these are reasonable motives to have, and we are reasonably effective at achieving these motives. They just don't correspond to what we say. We just have this habit of a disconnect between what we say and what we do.
And even what we think.
Right. But the point is that disconnect goes all over the place in our abstract ideas. We just aren't much in the habit of connecting our abstract ideas to our concrete actions. If we were, we would notice these conflicts in our motives, right? The whole reason we can write this whole book about the elephant in the brain is that people are just not in the habit of even noticing what their abstract beliefs imply about their concrete behaviors, and bringing those into harmony. That's just not a very common habit. People who talk abstractly just tend to connect abstract beliefs to each other, but they don't tend to connect them much to their practical behaviors.
So what would you say are the primary functions, the primary utility of knowing these kinds of things? Certain things I can think about are insight into others. It allows you to understand other people's behavior more. It allows you to understand your own behavior more. It can even allow you, I think, to get what you value more effectively because you're working with the grain of human nature as opposed to against it. What are other pragmatic functions of understanding this?
Well, so first, you have to admit, you were designed not to see this stuff.
It defeats the purpose if you see through all the illusions.
Right. So that means to the extent that your goals are aligned with what evolution had in mind for you and that the situation hasn't changed, you're probably better off not knowing this stuff.
Too late. That can of worms is open.
And if that's true, then you should just forget this. And and that's something most of you are capable of. Like we talk about how at school, most people just forget most of what they supposedly learned at school. So you can just forget this too.
I hope the listener's been lifting weights or doing housework and not paying attention.
But you might be an exception to what evolution had in mind for you. You might have an unusual role in our world today. You might be a salesperson or manager, somebody who needs to understand the people around them unusually well. Or you might be just less socially skilled. It's more like me, in the sense that most people, they just sort of glide through the social world and their intuition just tells them what to do, and then mostly that works. So they don't actually have to notice that their conscious beliefs don't match their actions, because their actions are just going automatically on the system that they can't see very well and don't understand it. But if you are socially unskilled, then you're going to have to construct more of your behavior consciously. You're going to have to actually consciously decide what to do. And so knowing these things might help you. Now, you're not going to be able to do it as smoothly, as naturally as these other people, but at least maybe what you do awkwardly will make more sense if you actually think about the point of it. And then again, if you are a social scientist or a human scientist or policymaker whose job it is to understand some key part of the world, like say medicine, then I'd say you've signed up for needing to know the truth, even if it's uncomfortable. And so here you go.
How have you used this knowledge in your life? How has it changed the way you think, act, live?
Well, when people make requests of me that plausibly are requests to signal loyalty, ability, allegiance, I can more see it as that and then give them what they want, even if the thing they are asking for isn't like something that makes so much sense to me, right? So people, nerdy, semi-autistic types are often hear a request and they go, well, that doesn't make any sense. I don't see why you'd want that. And then they will deny the request or challenge it because it doesn't fit the justification that was given. Once you realize that people have these hidden motives, they're often asking for loyalty signals, they're often asking for ability signals, they're often asking for various ways to show them you care and reassure them of your connections to them. Once you know that that's often the subtext of what people are asking for, you can more often just give them what they ask or even more than what they ask, but you give them of the sort that that's what they probably want. They probably want to know, you notice them, you're paying attention to them, you care about them, you are concerned about them, you want things to go well for them, and you want to show them those things, and you should realize that, that's a reasonable thing to do. People can reasonably want that sort of reassurance. You probably do. And when you ask for things, you might not realize, I'm probably just asking for some reassurance here. And, say that's okay. Other people ask for it. You can ask for it too. You're doing it in this indirect way. Then the thing you're saying, it doesn't really make that much sense on its own terms. But you're probably just asking for reassurance.
It's shocking to me, ever since I first read your book, that I catch myself I will often say something and then catch myself thinking, why did I say that? And I realize that I'm attempting to signal something. I'm attempting to signal whatever it might be, intelligence, education.
Right.
Those are the primary ones. Those are the ones I'm probably most guilty of signaling.
You cannot change the fact that you care about what other people think about you.
Right.
But you might have some influence over which other people you care about. So choose them carefully. Who are you trying to impress about what? You can pick, the best people in history. You can try to impress Einstein, for example, if you want. And if you will more focus on what would impress Einstein, maybe that will have you behave in a way that you would more admire in yourself. You will want to impress somebody about something.
I think that's a key pragmatic idea there, that we just have our human nature. It is what it is. We have it for better or for worse. It is as it is. And then the idea would be to determine your values, ideally with minimal self-deception. Try to figure out what it is that you want to get in life, and then engineer your environment and your incentives to get there. That's a perfect example of engineering your incentives. You're trying to impress certain specific people that get you closer to what you value.
But you should not assume you know what you value as well as you'd like to think. Right? So you might think, look, I don't know what I value, but I know my values probably aren't that different from what most people's values are. So if they're doing something X, maybe I should do X too, because it probably gets me what I want. So it's a certain default, be more cautious about believing that you're different. Sometimes you do have strong enough evidence that you are different in certain ways that you should lean into that and, try to do the different thing. But it's too easy to assume that you're just really different when you're not.
The thing about bell curves is that almost nobody's on the end of them. Almost everyone's in the middle.
Right. But the other way to think about this, as I said before, is to think of this as a limited budget. Okay? Look, yes, you are human, but you have some wiggle room. It might be a lot less than you hoped it would be, but you have some. Now ask what your priority is. Where are you going to put your limited budget of self-awareness or altruism or coherent pursuit of some ideals you have, what's your priority going to be? And just try to make sure your top priority gets some attention. And then find, how much farther down the list you can go will depend on how much of a budget you have. Maybe you're not so sure, but make sure the top priority gets done.
It's not so much, can I signal? Can I not signal? It's more so, what do I signal to whom? And that's pretty much it. How can I align this? How can I align my goals with the grain of my nature? Because the nature is not going away. It's been around for a very long time. And if you could just flout it like that, then it wouldn't be that useful.
We just can't remake ourselves very easily, unfortunately. But look, over a long time, maybe humanity can slowly remake itself into very many different things over 1,000 or 1,000,000 years. But you, in the next 5 years, you'll have to accept a more limited range of changes you can make to yourself.
Okay. To wrap up, are there any changes you'd make to The Elephant in the Brain now that it's been 7 years since its publishing? Would you make any changes? Would you add any ideas?
Well, I mean, we cited some research that's been criticized in the replication crisis, so we might just want to make sure that that was more solid in the citations. Otherwise, I don't know that I would change so much.
Any specific examples?
None. I mean, we just cite a lot of psych-critical research, but usually like in a relatively supporting role. Not that many things depend on very particular things. So no. I guess the most interesting fact I would say is that we didn't inspire very much other effort in this direction. So we basically said, look, we have hidden motives, and let us show you 10 areas of life where they are in fact make a big difference. And these aren't the only 10 areas. You can probably find another 30 areas of life where hidden motives are real and they make a difference. We showed you how to look for the hidden motives, because we give you 10 examples of how we did it.
There's no reason to assume it's not everywhere.
Right, but we haven't really inspired many people to go look for those other areas.
People essentially just said, oh yeah, cool, we have hidden motives. All right, I have a life to get to. Nice book.
There's a really surprising, perhaps, lack of curiosity about what are all the other hidden motives we have.
Shocking to me, frankly. All right. Robin Hanson, folks, where can people find you?
Might just Google my name.
Easy enough. I will link any links associated to you in the description. And obviously, The Elephant in the Brain, excellent book. One of those rare books that the second time I read it, it was even better than the first time.
Well, thank you.
All right. Thank you very much for talking to me. If you like this episode, I recommend these. This one's a conversation with Dr. David Pinsoff on evolutionary psychology and self-deception, similar to today's conversation. And this one is one selected specifically for you by the YouTube algorithm. Thank you very much for watching, and enjoy the next episode.